So good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank everybody for coming out to attend our virtual meeting today and for attending my talk specifically. I want to make sure that I lay out at the beginning of the presentation that what I'm going to be discussing today, it should be applicable to all types of libraries. I've made sure that I stayed platform agnostic, even recommended a few free platforms that could be helpful for what I want to talk about. Um, and I also want to note that I've tried to focus this presentation on the basics of assessment as well, since it's my desire to be sure that everyone, no matter where they are, can do some kind of effective assessment on their institution's virtual efforts, and that's no matter where they are in the process. And that's the primary topic for this presentation as well. We'll be looking at how you can set up an effective toolkit for assessing your virtual events going forward. So without further ado, let's get started. So I feel that lately it's important to go ahead and acknowledge the virtual elephant in the room pretty early on. The past year has thrust every single kind of library employee into parts hitherto unknown to most of us. We've had to shift rapidly and change a lot of the ways that we do things in every single type of library. Despite how much we might have thought we had our online bases covered prior to the pandemic, we clearly didn't. We got left scrambling to figure out how to reshape our services. And I think that one thing that might have been dropped in all the confusion is the effort to assess our services, no matter what format they might be in. If this sounds familiar to you, then I want to quickly put you at ease by noting the famous phrase, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Yes, it's clear that since COVID, paradigm shifting changes have happened, but that's not even remotely the question. We're doing things a whole lot differently than we were before, and no question about it, the changes have thrown our traditional workflows into absolute chaos. And in fact, probably the only thing that we've kept track of decently well is the fact that we're doing more virtual stuff than we used to. Whether or not your library has in-person services available or not, the odds are that you have increased your virtual efforts in some way, shape, or form. For example, how many academic librarians did more than a random virtual synchronous session of library instruction in a given year? How many public librarians regularly held virtual story time before this? As with anything, I imagine that some surely did do exactly that. But my point is that most of us have seen our virtual footprints increase. But what hasn't increased with it are efforts to assess these virtual programs. In fact, assessment frequently gets overlooked in the mad dash to just get needed programs up and running for our patrons. I know it was the same at my institution when the pandemic first hit. We pivoted to online instruction, and all of a sudden, guess what we weren't doing anymore? Assessment of LI sessions. The situation has left me somewhat confused as an assessment librarian because despite the change in the method of delivery of the programming, the principles of assessment stay the same. And it's great news for creating stability in uncertain times. We may not be able to hand out paper surveys that we collect at the end of in-person events these days, but at the very least, we know that we still want the same types of things from assessment. We want to know if what we're doing is working or not. And the good news is that I think it's very much possible to build an effective toolkit for assessing your virtual efforts that can be just as effective as what you use to assess in-person events. So before you begin any kind of assessment program for any kind of event, it's important to start by answering a series of important questions. These questions are necessary to help you focus your efforts and get meaningful data back from what you're trying to measure. I have 5 basic questions that I like to ask about any assessment in any format that help me form a good foundation to build quality assessments on. These questions will work no matter what format the thing you're assessing is and are designed to be as general as possible. They're as follows. What are you assessing? And so, I mean, what is the thing that you're trying to get data from? What do you want to know about the thing you're assessing? Do you want to know whether it was successful? Do you want to know whether people learned things from it? Do you want to know if people engaged with it? You have to answer those questions. What is the audience for the thing you're assessing? Or is it undergraduate students? Is it kids? Is it parents? Is it graduate students? Is it faculty? What is it? You have to know who you're assessing. They're very, very different things that you can find out about each different audience. You also want to know what platform or format are you using and what tools work best with it. We know what works good for in-person stuff. And we'll talk more about what platforms and formats work for different types of virtual formats. And the 5th one is, do you want to retool an old assessment or create a new one? Either answer is valid, but you can know that you can even retool and use some virtual assessment or some in-person assessment stuff for virtual things. You don't always have to start from scratch. And then finally, I always want people to remember is the key to it is don't overthink it. You can tweak assessments when they're out there, but we get bogged down in how we're thinking about assessing. We want things to be perfect. So just know that it's important to get quick answers to these questions and go forward. You can always tweak an assessment or use less than ideal data, but you can't use data that you don't have. So I'm going to go ahead and combine my discussion of the first two questions because they're best looked at together. You have to start the process of answering what you're assessing in the first place. Just because your events fall under the umbrella of virtual doesn't mean you're going to approach them in the same way. A Facebook Live story time is going to be assessed very differently from an event in Zoom for adults, which would be assessed differently than a virtual workshop or class, which will be done differently than some kind of asynchronous online event. Each has its own unique needs for assessment purposes, so it's critical that you determine the answer to what you're assessing early on. This question will guide the rest, and all of the questions that follow more or less flow from the next. So the next obvious question you want to ask is, what do you want to know about it? Do you just want to gauge attendance, engagement during the event, or with library collections after the event? Do you want to gauge learning after a class session? Just like with knowing what you want to assess, knowing what you want to measure from the event is also important and is going to guide your approach to assessment as well. Each of the things I just mentioned would have radically different approaches to collecting data and would require very different parts of the library to work. So it's crucial to have this question answered definitively before you move on. So the next step you want to take is asking yourself what the audience is for the event you're trying to assess. Just like different events have different assessment requirements, so do different audiences. Because even the same audience can have different assessment needs based on where you're engaging with them and what you want to know about the event, I put this question third in the line. Just think about the myriad ways audiences can differ. For example, if you're doing a virtual story time for preschoolers, you'd create a different form of assessment than you would a book reading targeted at adults. If you're targeting undergraduate students, you would structure the assessment differently than you would for faculty. Each audience has their own unique set of needs and ways they can be assessed, at least if you want any meaningful data from it. I mean, and you can also look at that as, different audiences have different assessment things on different platforms. So you could do preschoolers via Zoom, and it would be a different type of assessment than it would be if you were doing preschoolers via Facebook Live or something like that. So the audience can be the same and vary from platform to platform. So that's why we need to answer what platform the event or whatever it might be is going to use. Because especially in the virtual world, different platforms have different needs and different metrics for what quote unquote successful means. It means you need to tailor your approach to assessment for what the platform is best designed for. If you're doing an event or campaign on social media, social media is designed primarily to promote engagement among your followers, tracking things like likes, follows, comments, or even click-through on links will probably yield the best measurement of effective events on those platforms. But what wouldn't work best for social media might be more involved forms of assessment like surveys, focus groups, or anything that takes significant time investment from participants. People on social media want to get in, get out, and do some brief engagement, but that's about it. If you're doing some other kind of digital event, it would help to explore what kinds of built-in assessment tools already exist. For example, the platform we're meeting in today has some built-in metrics you could use, like polling or internal quizzes. Other and pricier platforms like Whova have comprehensive built-in assessment tools for you to take advantage of. If your library is laying out the big bucks for virtual, you may also want to explore some external survey options as well, just so you have some data from the event. But keep in mind the first couple of questions. What are you assessing, and what do you want to know about it when making your surveys? And above all, keep them short for better response rates. At VSU, we've had pretty good success measuring our virtual events with very short post-event surveys. So keep that in mind and try to offer the link to the surveys at the end of the event or in the page or content that you want to assess. So when you're creating these assessments, ask yourself if you want to reinvent the wheel or not. If you're just moving an event you did physically online, you shouldn't need to tweak existing assessments much other than to add questions specific to the virtual experience and possibly, recreating a paper survey in the virtual format. However, I do still recommend you consider the platform, and where it makes sense, you may want to retool how you assess events. One thing I can definitely think of is moving a story time event to something like Instagram or Facebook Live. Because these platforms don't lend themselves well to more traditional assessments used for these programs, you might want to turn what they use as measurements of success on the platform. Engagement is great, and you should be watching that all the time. Track how many watch the stream and how many engage with it through some kind of like system or through commenting. You can definitely include surveys here through a comment link. Just want to be sure that, okay, so through a comment link and in the comments or embedded in the screen during the stream, but you may not be able to count on super high response rates here. People just don't respond to surveys on social media that much. Are you moving physical displays into the virtual world? Well, there's always things like tracking clicks on the traditional. But no matter what, be sure to put some thought into the previous questions before getting here. I've also found it never hurts to informally reach out to your target audience to figure out what they're most likely to do assessment-wise. We rely on student assistants here at Valdosta State for helpful input regarding our virtual efforts, but check in with whoever your regular allies are and see what they think. Whoops. Okay, cool. I thought it lost the presentation there for a minute. Even though I've just spent several minutes going through a lot of questions I think you should ask before creating virtual assessments, I also think that the most important advice is to not overthink it. When you make perfect the enemy of the good in assessment, things tend to not get assessed. Assessment's an ever-evolving process, so please keep that in mind. You're likely going to need to tweak things regardless of what you put out there, so don't worry about getting it perfect from the get-go. Instead, put something together you think is going to work based on your answers to the previous questions I discussed and get it out there collecting data. If you need to tweak it later, so be it, but don't let it get tweaked to death while you're waiting to put it out there. You can work with bad or incomplete data to draw conclusions anytime. What you can't work with is no data. So by all means, answer the questions I discussed, but don't delay a great deal in answering them. Getting the assessment out and collecting data, for me anyway, is the most important thing that you can do. So now that I've discussed how to create an assessment for your virtual efforts, I want to take some time to discuss how to put together a virtual toolkit with assessment tools that you can make use of to assess all things virtual. There's some suggestions here over the next few slides, and it's my goal to keep this as platform agnostic as possible so that everyone can take as much value as they can from it. The key points I'll be covering for setting up your toolkit are: you need to prioritize what you already have access to or know well, over purchasing or adapting an unknown method that you don't know anything about. The known is so much better than the unknown for this. Use built-in metrics on platforms wherever it's possible. That's going to make your life a lot easier. You do have options for outside surveys. They're both free and subscription-based. And you have outside metrics options. These are primarily for social media engagement, and they're nearly all subscription-based and very pricey, so keep that in mind. So if you really, really want to do social media assessment, you can, but just know it's going to cost you. So when you first create an assessment toolkit, an important thing to remember is to use what's already in your arsenal. What you already have that's working well and you can adapt to the virtual world if necessary. Budgets in all types of libraries continue to be stretched thinner with each passing year, and testing new technologies to deploy virtual assessment of your events, programming, and instruction might be a nice want to have, but it's definitely not necessarily needed. Take stock of what you have and what you can build with what you have on hand. Even if you have zero virtual tools at your disposal right now, I'm going to discuss some free options momentarily that can transform most physical pen and paper assessments to ones that can be taken online. The important takeaway here is that you can definitely do this with what you have in the library already. You don't need to dedicate a great deal of resources to your virtual assessment as long as you have some form of assessment in place. One of the ways you can leverage what you have on hand is to use the metrics that are built into products that your library already has some kind of subscription to. Since most, if not all, of the academic folks attending this meeting would be from the USG, we all use BB Ultra at this point, which has polling, quizzes, and other built-in assessment tools to help you track how virtual events are going. We also have access to the Qualtrics survey building software, which is extremely robust and should be used if you have access to it at all. If you're doing some kind of effort through your social media, you can use their built-in metrics. Twitter has analytics.twitter.com. Instagram has Instagram Insights, and which can be accessed through your user profile in the app. Facebook has facebook.com/analytics. None of these are particularly robust in my experience, but they can provide some good basic data for you to use to assess engagement on your platform. In the case of these analytics, you don't even have to set anything up. They're already working whether you knew it or not. You just go in and look at them for the posts, streams, etc. you've done, and the analytics will be there. It's the best possible world for assessment, in my opinion. No cost and no effort. So even if you have nothing else, you know you can rely on some basic social media metrics for very, very basic analysis of your virtual efforts. Even if you don't want to get into engagement analytics, you can also just utilize simple polling options across all three platforms for some very quick and simple data gathering. Of course, you can get more complex assessment capabilities across these platforms, but we'll get into that later. Of course, not every tool you might use for your virtual efforts will come with robust analytics installed, or perhaps you want something different than what the platform offers. In that case, you need to turn to external options. The good news is that there are an absolute ton of these out there, and many of them offer at least some kind of free tier. Even then, there are some things that are already offered by your institution that you can leverage to help assess your efforts. I mentioned already, if you're an academic librarian within the University System of Georgia, there's an extremely robust survey option called Qualtrics. If I'm not mistaken, I also believe that Mercer and Emory offer those platforms on their campuses as well. So two of the biggest private institutions in the state are covered as well. Let you create surveys in several different and interesting ways that can be used to assess a broad range of virtual efforts. Even before VSU went virtual with our events, we use this platform as our primary event assessment tool to great success. Qualtrics is great for those who have it, but what about those who don't? Or if you want something slightly different. For academic librarians, I suggest ACRL's Project Outcome Toolkit. It contains ready-made surveys about library efforts, including instruction, programs, library space, technology, teaching support, and digital collections. It provides a nice standardized set of assessments and contains great visualization tools as well. For public or other kinds of libraries, I would recommend a couple of options. First is SurveyMonkey, which is less robust than Qualtrics in my experience, but still offers some good basic level surveying capabilities in its free tier. Should your library have money to spend on such things, right? There's also a paid tier that offers you more options. Or you can go the route that most public libraries in Georgia, at least to my knowledge, do, and leverage your G Suite projects to make Google Forms for assessment. These can create excellent assessments that give you back robust data, and they have the added benefit of being familiar to a lot of public library users who use Google's products in their own day-to-day work. So as you can see, there's a wealth of options out there. I didn't go into detail about what you can and can't do with these platforms, but I'm confident in saying that between these platforms that I've talked about, you should be able to assess just about any kind of event that you could imagine. There are still a few other options for assessing your virtual efforts. I mentioned earlier that we discuss more complex social media metrics later, and we've reached that point now. If the basic analytics offered by a social media platform aren't enough for what you want to look at, there are a number of companies that offer some options for very robust and complex social media monitoring and metrics. There are none that I've come across that offer this service for free, so only those who are willing to spend some money on the effort should consider these options. If you already use a platform like Buffer or Hootsuite to schedule your social media posts but are on the free tier, for a relatively small fee, you can upgrade to some paid plans like $35 a month for Buffer, a whole lot more than that for Hootsuite, that include robust analytics on your audience, words that get them engaged, and they do social listening as well. It obviously isn't for everyone, especially not during tight budget times, but if your library has the money, let me know who they are, for one, and assessing social media is of the utmost importance. They can provide some possible options for you. So at this point, I've discussed how to plan an assessment and tools for conducting the assessment. So now it's important to cover what happens after you're finished with the assessment and need to do something with the data. If you're going through the trouble of planning and conducting assessments, you don't just want your data to sit on a shelf and never be analyzed or even looked at. So just as there should be a plan to create or modify the plan for assessing your virtual efforts, there needs to be a plan for what you do after. Just like with planning the assessment, I think you can best plan for the post-assessment phase by answering 3 questions. How are you going to organize and analyze the data that you collected? How will you present that data, and to whom will you present it? And finally, how will you preserve the data you collected and make sure it outlasts any end of life or subscription ending events? So the first question to answer, how are you going to organize and analyze the data you've collected? It's one thing to go out and collect the data, and it can be exciting to see it come in. I know I've got several things going right now, and it's super exciting to see stuff come in. But it's going to be for nothing if you don't have a plan to organize it and create analyses for the data that are going to help transform it into something meaningful for you. In a lot of ways, it's going to be driven by your answers early on to the questions, what are you assessing and what do you want to know about it? This will let you know what analyses are going to be best for you to do and how to most effectively organize the data to get the answers that you're seeking. It's the most important step in the post-assessment process. You can't make good data presentations, nor can you make those presentations make sense to anybody if you haven't done the work to organize and analyze it first. You don't have to be a certified expert in statistics to do this step, nor does a complicated statistical analysis always make the best analysis. Sometimes just seeing that the overwhelming majority of attendees want more events like this on a pie chart or graph is all you need. Just like the previous questions, you don't need to overthink them. Just answer them in a way that works for you. So once you have your data organized and analyzed, the next question to answer is how or to who are you going to present it? Who's the data for? Is this something for internal use? Do you want to share it with the community? At VSU, we do display some of the results of some of our assessments on a web page, while others are used internally to guide decisions and practice. Other more informal assessments are done via social media and displayed real time, and by their nature are ephemeral and not long lasting. But for data you plan to keep, think about how you want to present these data. In many ways, how you organize and analyze the data is going to dictate a lot of how you present the data. For example, if you decide to do simple descriptive statistical analyses like top choice, number of replies, number of attendees, then bar, pie, or line charts are totally fine and are going to work for what you want. You have more choices at hand with trying to present more complex qualitative data like interviews, focus groups, or short answer surveys. For these things, you can code and present in similar ways to your quantitative data, present highlights from the responses, or create a summary of findings from the data. There are many roads you can venture down when looking for a way to present your data, but the key is that you need to pick one and go with it. And finally, you should be asking yourself how you're going to preserve the data that you collect. To be sure, not everything needs to be preserved. For example, those ephemeral online polls via social media I mentioned earlier, but screenshots can always preserve them if needed. However, I started my career as an archivist, so I'm always overly concerned with data preservation. Then we have access to Qualtrics now in the USG. What's going to happen if that stops? What will public libraries do if they move away from Google? What will you do with your data in any subscription service if it goes away eventually? For most of these, it will mean preserving the raw, unprocessed data, though some will let you download analysis as well. You should be downloading both and copies of the assessments as well when you finish your data analyses and presentations. You never know when you'll need access to this data, so it's important to make sure the data is where you can access it if needed. I know it seems like an afterthought in the world of assessment, but believe me, it is well worth the effort in the long run. You do not want to lose access to this data if you're going to need it for the long term. So that's everything I think you need to consider for effectively assessing your virtual efforts. And if you think that sounds a lot like what you'd be doing to assess your in-person efforts, you're completely right. Some of the questions you might ask would change based on the format you're presenting the info in. Like you might ask how someone rated the technology for the event rather than the physical space it took place in. But other than that, the core fundamentals of assessment won't change a lot for virtual. You go through the same steps, you answer the same types of question. It's all the same no matter what you're assessing. That said, there are some options for assessing things virtually that would be new to folks who have only worked with pen and paper assessments previously, which is why I dedicated time in this presentation to discuss some tools for assessing things virtually for your assessment toolkit. But I would have to imagine that most librarians will be at least somewhat familiar with these tools and what they can do. Though it may seem disappointing to hear that virtual assessment's not that different from other kinds of assessment, I personally think it's great news in the end. It means you don't have to reinvent the wheel to get out there and start assessing things. And because it's adaptable to any kind of effort from your library, the fact that we have a vaccine and might be seeing a glimmer of hope for the end of the pandemic at this point does not mean that you're too late to take any of this and start adapting it to your own assessment efforts. You can simply take these tools and apply them to in-person events, and you'll find yourselves ready to pivot quickly to all virtual again if necessary, or ready to continue assessing virtual efforts as they will doubtlessly continue to some extent post-pandemic. It's a win-win all around for librarians who have always wanted to assess their virtual efforts but have never been sure how to do so. So that's all I have today, so I'm going to open it up for questions now. Let's see what we've got. Nope, no questions came in the chat. So. And if anybody wants this presentation, how do you combat survey fatigue? Amanda asked how you combat survey fatigue. I try to make surveys very, very short, especially for events. As few questions as we can possibly ask. And luckily, since events typically involve different audiences, that doesn't necessarily give us survey fatigue. but keeping them short keeps people from getting them annoyed with it. And for the bigger surveys, like we actually created an alternative to LibQual because we found that our students just thought LibQual was, just completely not understandable. We try to run big things like that on a not annual basis, but say like every other year. We try to space out those big surveys that we do to try and prevent some survey fatigue. Um, we try not we try to think of other things we can do besides surveys. We try to mix it in with like focus groups. We try to do customer service through secret shoppers. And so if we can do things besides surveys, we do that. So we don't always just send out a survey. Those are the basic ways that we combat survey fatigue. But yeah, I mean, you're still going to get it a little, but the key is just, try not to survey too much. And when you do survey it, make it super simple for them to take it. Oh, yes, yes. Project Outcome is awesome, and Project Outcome is free. I will mention for our public librarians who might be in here that Project Outcome is sadly only for academic librarians right now, and probably forever. But yes, if you are an academic librarian, Project Outcome is awesome. Ready-made surveys in there for lots of different things, and just about anything that you might want to assess that is outside of like your back end catalog type stuff that you do in Alma. So yeah, no, Project Outcome is awesome. And I'll wait a couple more minutes for questions to come in, and we'll see, because I know it takes people a minute to type things out if they don't want to get on mic. Okay, I'm not hearing anything. I'm going to put my email address in. And if anybody has any further questions or wants a copy of the presentation, just let me know. So thanks very much, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now, and we'll get on to our next presentation shortly.
All right, everyone.